The cool fall air in Greenwood Cemetery in New York rustled the golden-brown leaves strewn over the stone paths. Alexander Carter left his sleek black Cadillac and changed the cuffs of his bespoke suit. Rich and powerful, he oversaw a multi-billion-dollar technological company. But he sensed none of the power that distinguished him in the business world as he strolled across the cemetery, past rows of old tombstones. Today was the 5th anniversary of the death of his wife Evelyn. Every year, he traveled alone to pay tribute to the lady he had loved most of all. There are not any board sessions, not a merger, not a deadline, just solitude and the unbounded anguish that never seemed to pass. His shined sneakers crunching across the gravel as he walked toward her tomb caught his attention. Something strange. Sitting next to Evelyn's tombstone, a small lad had his little arms about his knees. Given the extreme cold, the kid could not have been more than 6 or 7 and wore a thin, faded jacket. His pale face showed great grief, and his brown hair was disordered. What happens next will shock everyone. But before we start, let's do something fun. Comment your location below. Let's see who's watching from the farthest place. All right, let's begin. The eyebrows of Alexander wrinkled. He had made sure he wouldn't notice strangers close to his wife's tomb. This lad seemed as though he belonged somewhere. Who was he? Alexander cleared his throat and spoke with the weight of authority and inquiry. Hey lad, are you missing? The lad looked up, his big, tearful eyes locking into Alexander's with a force that stopped him. Those eyes seemed strangely familiar, something that brought a weird discomfort crawling up his spine. The lad gave a slow headshake. No, he uttered in a whisper. I want to see my mother. Alexander briefly felt he had misheard. His heart thumping against his ribs, he felt a cold, creeping sensation in his chest. With a faltering voice, "You're what?" he asked. The lad hesitated, then gestured to the name Evelyn Carter etched on the granite gravestone. The planet seemed to spin. Alexander felt his breath stop as his mind ran in a frantic search for meaning from what he had just heard. At least not known to him. His wife had never been pregnant. Though they had discussed having children, life had gotten in the way. The long hours, the stress, the quiet sacrifices they had both made. She was suddenly gone, taken in a terrible accident that had left Alexander broken before they could ever make it happen. Still, there was a youngster claiming to be her son. His heartbeat roared in his ears as his hands closed into fists. He bent next to the lad, his typically calm manner breaking at the margins. What did you say? This time his voice was smaller, almost terrified of the response. The lad sniffled and used his sleeve to clear his nose. He said softly, "She was my mom. She used to come visit me before she left." Alexander's spine quipped with a chill. His head shouted that this was unworkable. Would Evelyn have told her child if she had won before they got together? And why had she never uttered a word if she had borne this boy after their marriage? He examined the youngster more closely. Unquestionably, there was similarity. The same gentle brown eyes, the delicate features Evelyn's had echoed. He seemed to be staring at a bit of her that had somehow stayed in this world, kept from him until now. Hardly swallowing, he pushed himself to remain cool. "What's your name, youngster?" he said. "Liam," the youngster said gently. For Alexander, whose mind was a flurry of emotions, shock, uncertainty, and a great sense of betrayal, the name had nothing. If this youngster was speaking the truth, Evelyn had concealed a secret from him that might change his life. Still, why? And therefore, the one person he had ever seen, the man under the polished billionaire facade, his wife, had been the one he had trusted totally. Unless she had a cause, she wouldn't have hidden something like this. Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair and breathed forcefully. "Where are you from, Liam?" Once more, the lad stopped, his fingertips following Evelyn's tombstone's edge. "At the refuge," he at last said. "In Brooklyn. They look after me over there." Alexander felt his chest becoming constricted. Little child, living in a shelter, Evelyn's daughter. His stomach turned over with just the very concept. How then could this have happened? Why was he not among family? His father's location is suddenly, like a goods train. He had ideas. "Who told you Evelyn was your mother?" Alexander asked, his voice charged with eagerness. Liam looked up, his face a mix of innocence and grief. Miss Joan at the homeless shelter. She claimed my mother left me there when I was a baby. She loved me, but was unable to keep me. She visited occasionally, however, but she stopped visiting. Miss Joan said she visited paradise. In the last phrase, Alexander's little voice shook, and he felt something inside break. Evelyn had been going to see this lad, believing he knew everything about her. He had spent years mourning her loss, and yet there had been a whole portion of her life he had never even suspected. A secret child, dropped at a shelter. She had chosen to withhold this from him. What had been so dreadful, so impossible? Though his head spun with questions, there were no quick answers, only the cold wind, the smell of fall, and the small lad seated next to his wife's grave. His boy. Assuming what Liam said was accurate, Alexander, stroking his temples, felt a strange powerlessness come over him. With money or authority, he was unable to control this. Neither a crisis he could resolve, nor a commercial agreement he could negotiate here. Though this was personal, he may assign this to his board members. This was Evelyn, and somehow in the middle of it all was a small child unsure of the extent he had just turned Alexander's life upside down. Alexander was unsure about what to do for the first time in years, but one thing was certain. He couldn't simply walk away. Please subscribe to our channel, like, and forward to your friends before heading to the next section. Alexander stood motionless, his breath creating little misty clouds in the frigid New York air. The small lad next to his wife's tomb has just destroyed what he knew about Evelyn. Though his logic rejected the concept, the feelings in his chest told otherwise. His life had been based on reason, strategy, and cautious judgment. Yet here he was, peering into the tear-filled eyes of a child that resembled the lady he had loved rather exactly. Every thread of his existence yearned to reject it, to turn away and persuade himself that this was some error. He was unable, though. Liam tethered Alexander to the present with something in his face, clinging to the gravestone as though it were his only link to a mother he hardly knew. He choked hard and pushed himself to talk, his voice softer now, measured. "Who else knows about this?" he questioned. Liam lowered down and kicked the dropped leaves close to the monument. "Just Miss Joan," he said softly. "She told me when I reached old enough comprehension level. She claimed my mother loved me, but was unable to look after me. She stopped. She used to come occasionally." The lad paused, then turned to look once again. "Did she stop because of you?" The question struck Alexander like a gut-reversing blow. Slightly staggered back, he was taken aback by Liam's unvarnished innocence. His pulse hammered as the ramifications sank in. Had Evelyn concealed this child from him out of remorse then? Had she thought of his response? Although he had never been nasty, he understood himself. He was a man who expected honesty, who prized control, who never handled unanticipated anarchy. Had she feared that telling him would destroy them? He bent down to level his eye with Liam's. "I didn't know about you," he continued, his voice tinged with both remorse and incredulity. "Everything would have been different if I had." Still, he questioned if the things he spoke were accurate even as he said them. Would he have approved of this? Would he have adopted another man's child and reared it as his own? His fingers closed into fists, burning inside him. He had questions, real answers, and only one place to begin. Straightening up, he grabbed his phone and went through his contacts until he came to the number for Daniel Reeves, his private investigator. "I need you to check into something for me." He mentioned it right away the instant the line connected. A lad called Liam at a Brooklyn shelter. Learn everything. His biological father is, how he got there, and whether any records link him to Evelyn. He cut off the phone before Daniel could probe any more. He lacked a tolerance for explanations just now. He turned back toward Liam, who was observing him with wary interest. Alexander responded, reaching for his hand. "Come with me." The youngster stopped. "Where?" "Someplace warm. You shouldn't be outside in this frigid temperature." One last time Liam looked at the headstone and slid his little hand into Alexander's. Though it was a small act, it set off an unanticipated emotional tsunami. He guided the lad to his car, belted him into the passenger seat, and got underway toward Brooklyn. His head was a whirlpool of contradictory feelings. The weight of the situation dimmed the normal vibrant energy of the New York streets. which passed in a blur. Alexander parked and walked out of the little brick building buried between two tall buildings. When they arrived at the refuge, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets, Liam trailed reluctantly inside. The front desk was manned by an exhausted-looking woman in her 60s. The air smelled of disinfectant and old books. She moved her glasses to see Liam. "Back already, sweetheart?" she replied gently. Her eyes then turned to Alexander, her look cautious. "Furthermore, you are?" Pulling out his wallet and slipping a business card across the bar, he added, "Alexander Carter. I should talk with Miss Joan." The woman paused for a second, then nodded and vanished into a hall. A few minutes later, a small, gray-haired woman surfaced. She went to Alexander after first smiling warmly at Liam, her keen blue eyes fixating on him. She said, "Mr. Carter," her voice unreadable. "I was wondering when you might arrive." Her comments again sent another shock wave through him. With a wary voice, he questioned, "You knew who I was?" Miss Joan nodded and opened her hands in front of her. "She told me about you," Evelyn said. "She promised never to seek out or notify you. She wanted to shield you too." His patience then, he asked, "Protect me from what?" The weight of the truth was pressing on the older woman, who moaned, her voice softening. "Evelyn adored you, Mr. Carter." She could not escape her past, though. She had already made the toughest decision of her life when she met you, giving up Liam so he would have a brighter future. She wanted to tell you, but she was gone by the time she built up the confidence. Alexander's tummy turned over. Believing he had known Evelyn better than anyone, he had been grieving her for years. Still, she had lived a part of her life that had stayed secret from him. He glanced at Liam, who was staring at the floor with little shoulders hunched as though he were bracing for rejection. His heart seized at what he saw. Anger at Evelyn for hiding this from him. Grief for the lad who had grown up without a mother, or guilt for not knowing sooner. He was not sure what he was meant to feel. He inhaled deeply, then turned back to Miss Joan. He questioned, "What happens to him now?" She fixed him with a measured glance. "That depends on you, Mr. Carter," she advised. "He lacks legal guardians and family. He arrived here when he was a baby. Nothing changes if you go away. He lives here, awaiting a house that might never materialize. However, that is up to you should you want to live with him." The weight of the choice descended on Alexander. Today he had entered the graveyard intending to leave flowers and spend quiet time gassing. Rather, he had left with a child who might be his responsibility, a child linked to the woman he had loved most of all. He gazed down at Liam, still not meeting his eyes. He stretched out slowly, carefully, and rested a hand on the youngster's little shoulder. "Come on, youngster," he urged softly. "Let us get out of here." At last Liam turned to gaze, his eyes wide with astonishment and cautious optimism. He trailed Alexander out the door silent. The billionaire who had spent years creating an empire and precisely managing every element of his life suddenly understood he was first entering the unknown. Driven across the busy streets of New York, Alexander felt the weight of the evening's discoveries firmly upon him. The city's brilliant lights and continuous action seemed strange, as though he had been thrown into another's existence. He looked at Liam, seated silently in the passenger seat, tiny hands clutching the margins of his big jacket. The lad gazed out the window, his face displaying a mixture of uncertainty and tiredness. Alexander knew not what to say to him, given that the very presence of the child he had just met had upended all he knew. How was he expected to console him? As he exhaled gently, he tightened his hold on the steering wheel, therefore pushing himself to concentrate on what was to be done next. Pulling into his Upper East Side penthouse's subterranean parking, he turned to Liam and stopped the engine. "Come on," he murmured, speaking less than usual. The lad stopped momentarily, then nodded and trailed him into the private elevator. The quiet between them got worse when the doors closed. In silence, Alexander had always been at ease. Negotiations, business meetings, boardrooms loaded with high-stakes judgments. But this was not the case. There was nothing about mergers or stocks here. This was about a lad who had lost everything before he could even begin to grasp what a family meant. Liam's eyes became wide as soon as they entered the apartment, absorbing the floor-to-ceiling windows and lofty ceilings. Before them was an amazing perspective of Manhattan, and the large area was covered in elegant, simple furnishings. It was a house meant for a man living deliberately, not for a youngster. Alexander became instantly aware of how chilly and detached it must feel to Liam. One never had. Hence there were no toys, no indication of warmth, no proof that a family had ever lived there. Alexander cleared his voice and laid his keys down on the marble counter. "You hungry?" he said. Before nodding, Liam paused. "Sure, a bit." Alexander had no idea what children ate. Did he even have anything in his refrigerator other than pre-made gourmet meals or reasonably priced wine? He opened the refrigerator, looking over the well-arranged shelves, then chose something basic. "How about grilled cheese?" he said. Liam's face softened just a little. "All right." Though it was such a little matter, the boy's voice's hint of affection caused something in Alexander's chest to relax. He struggled at this, but at least he could create a sandwich. The sizzle of butter in the skillet permeated the kitchen as he worked. With his small hands wandering along bookshelf edges, Liam strayed toward the living room. He halted before a framed picture on the mantel, one of Evelyn. His fingertips floated over the glass, as though he were reluctant to touch it. "She was rather beautiful," he said. Alexander took a hard gulp and moved over to stand next to Liam as they both gazed at the picture of the woman they had both lost. "Yeah," he answered silently. "She was." The lad looked at him, scrutinizing his face. "Do you love her?" The question struck Alexander in an unexpected manner. Though it was a basic term, it had great weight. Though he had loved Evelyn with everything he had, he now saw there had been much about her he had never known. Was that to say his love had been inadequate? He let out a leisurely breath. "Indeed," he said. "Yeah, I did. A lot." Liam nodded as though the response addressed something deep inside him. He responded, "Miss Jones said she loved me too." Softly. "But she couldn't keep me." Alexander felt his throat tighten as his voice faltered slightly. This child had spent his whole life wondering why his mother hadn't stayed. Now, standing in a stranger's house, he was most likely wondering if he would be left behind once more. Alexander had never possessed maternal qualities. He had erected barriers around himself, choosing reason and control over feelings. But looking at Liam now, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave. Though he had no idea what the future contained, he wasn't going to let this lad negotiate it on his own. Liam sat cozily on the large leather couch after dinner, his little frame almost buried in the soft cushions. Lost in contemplation, Alexander sat in the recliner across from him sipping scotch. He had already told Daniel to probe Evelyn's background, uncover all there was to know about Liam's father, if he was still alive, whether he presented any kind of threat. But there was a part of him. Alexander already knew what the researcher would discover. Liam had only himself. That insight dropped firmly in his chest. Liam's blink slowed as the hours went by. His head nodded forward just before he jolted himself awake. Watching him, Alexander debated whether to let him sleep where he was or send him to one of the guest rooms. Liam's voice disturbed the quiet before he could decide. "Are you going to email me back?" The inquiry was so subtle, so full of uncertainty, that Alexander felt it like a cut to the gut. He dropped his drink and slanted forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you want to go back?" he asked. Liam gave a swift head shake. "No, I could find it anywhere else." Alexander ran a hand through his hair and let out a leisurely breath. He wasn't ready for this. He lacked the tools necessary to be a parent, let alone a guardian. But this youngster had already suffered enough. "Then you stay," he urged with great conviction. Liam's eyes grew somewhat, as though he had not anticipated that response. "Very truly." Alexander nodded. "Yeah, we will work it out." Though Liam said nothing, the way his small shoulders relaxed and his grasp on the blanket lessened told Alexander all he needed to know. A few minutes later, Liam was fast asleep, his breathing steady and smooth. Alexander reclined and peered out the window at the metropolitan skyline. His life had always been exactly scheduled, every action deliberate. Still, all had changed in the course of one evening. He had entered a cemetery hoping to be alone in his grieving, and left carrying a child who would change the path of his whole life. Though he had no idea what lay ahead, He felt something other than nothingness for the first time in years. Alexander woke up in his apartment, hearing just a slight stir. He laid in bed momentarily, staring at the ceiling, attempting to put together the events of the previous evening. Liam was here, the reality striking him fast. He was no more by himself. He pushed back the sheets and ran a hand over his face, attempting to get the tiredness off. Though his life had never been peaceful, this kind of noise, that of another person occupying his space, was quite different. He left into the living room and came upon Liam marveling at the city skyline from the large glass windows. Still wrapped in the blanket from the previous night, the lad's diminutive figure appeared even smaller against the backdrop of tall skyscrapers and the early sky, softly tinted with orange and pink. When Liam heard Alexander's footsteps, his eyes flicked with doubt, and he turned. "I wasn't sure whether I ought to wake you up," he murmured softly. Alexander waved a hand with contempt. "You're okay." He looked at the time clock. "At 6:30 a.m. too early," he said, not used to early mornings. He had long since turned from them to late-night gatherings, even later evenings, buried in work. But something about this morning felt different. Just a youngster looking like he wasn't sure he belonged at his penthouse. There was no business to hurry to or urgent calls demanding his attention. "Are you hungry?" Turning into the kitchen, Alexander questioned. Liam paused and nodded. Actually, Alexander was not very good at cooking, but he thought breakfast ought to be easy enough. He cracked some eggs from the refrigerator into a pan, the sizzle filling the quiet between them. Keeping his voice laid back, he asked, "Have you ever been to school?" Liam turned in his counter seat and experimented with the blanket's edge. "A modest bit. Miss Joan intended to homeschool me, but she had too many children to look after." Alexander nodded, not at all surprised. The foster system was taxed, and children like Liam sometimes slipped through the gaps. His life was everything from normal, so he wasn't sure how he felt about enrolling Liam in school. He had no idea how to provide the lad that type of consistency either. One thing he knew, though, was the child deserved a real opportunity at something better. Liam was quiet as they ate, but not totally withdrawn. He kept a tight eye on Alexander, as though still attempting to sort him out. When Alexander glanced at the lad, he was unsure of what he saw. A stranger, a lifeline, someone temporary. Being something permanent in someone's life unsettled him. In relationships, in commitment, in everything requiring emotional sensitivity, he had never been good. But he knew he had already silently committed himself, one he could not undo now, as he watched Liam push his scrambled eggs around his plate. The remainder of the morning blurred together. Alexander had phoned Daniel, telling him to compile anything they could discover on Liam's background, his birth certificate, any medical documents, anything that would enable him to know exactly what had happened to this child before he arrived at Evelyn's tomb. He would be more ready the more knowledge he possessed. Still, the unanswered question was what he meant to do with that knowledge. Was he just keeping Liam here until he found a better option? Or was he intending to adopt him, become his legal guardian? Or he lacked the answers. And for someone who had based his life on always knowing the next step, it was disturbing. By lunch, Liam had decided once more. He wanted fresh clothes. Everything about his look suggested neglect. The big jacket he had been sporting from the cemetery was obviously not his. Though he knew someone who did, Alexander wasn't sure how to shop for a child. Following a brief phone call, he saw Liam seated in the back seat of his car on their way to Fifth Avenue. There Rebecca, his assistant, was waiting. She was bright, quick, and the only one able to meet Alexander's erratic needs without faltering. She had spent years working for him, but even she looked shocked when she watched him get out of the car, carrying a child. Raising an eyebrow, she continued, "You didn't tell me you had a kid." Alexander turned to glance at her. "I am not." Liam stood nearby, obviously not sure Rebecca was here. She stared at him and melted. She bent slightly. "Hey there, my name is Rebecca. Your name is—" Then Liam hesitated before responding. Liam." She grinned. "Good to meet you, Liam. All right, let me get you some really nice clothes." Mostly because Rebecca took charge, the shopping trip went better than Alexander had anticipated. She was meticulous and knew how to make Liam comfortable. He saw Liam gradually unwind, selecting items he enjoyed, even once or twice smiling. Seeing the lad come to life, in a manner not seen the evening before, seemed odd. Liam had a new wardrobe when they were done, and Alexander realized he was gravitating toward something that felt perilously near to responsibility. Liam curled his feet under the couch that evening following dinner, leafing through a book Rebecca had purchased him. Alexander watched the city lights flutter outside, while seated across from him with a drink of whiskey in hand. "Do you ever find yourself terrified?" Not turning from his reading, Liam asked abruptly. The query caught Alexander off guard. He was a man who had personally suffered losses, financial crises, and merciless boardroom conflicts. At least not aloud. He did not recognize fear. "Sometimes," he said after a protracted silence. Liam nodded as though he knew. "Me too." Alexander had no idea why that revelation struck him the way it did. Possibly since Liam had every right to be afraid. He had lost his mother, had no father, and was now residing on an unfamiliar planet with a stranger. And still he was here, adjusting, surviving. Alexander was moved in a manner he hadn't anticipated by something in that calm resilience. Liam's eyelids grew sleepy as the evening carried on. His head gently dropped on the couch cushion. Alexander observed him for a bit, then got up and reached for the blanket from the other side of the couch. He lay it over the lad. Though he had no idea what the future contained, Liam knew one thing. He was not moving anywhere. Alexander had always thought that life ran best when it adhered to a set course. He had developed his empire on discipline, control, and measured risk. But nothing about his present circumstances fit any one of those standards. Since he had discovered Liam at Evelyn's grave a week ago, every day had been different. Now the lad was calmer, as if he was adjusting to his new reality. Still not totally persuaded it was permanent, Alexander, too, was adjusting to the changes. Once a sanctuary of stillness and efficiency, his penthouse now had little but obvious evidence of a child's presence. An additional plate at breakfast, books left on the coffee table, and the faint sound of a television running cartoons in the morning. About any of it, he wasn't clear how he felt. Alexander sat at Manhattan Towers in his office that morning, glancing at the financial figures on his desk, but his mind was elsewhere. Daniel now had more specifics about Liam's background, and the file was in front of him, ready to be opened. He drew a long breath, then turned the pages. He first came upon Liam's birth certificate. Evelyn Carter, the name of his mother, was noted, but the father had no name at all. Alexander had expected that, but he was more disturbed than he had anticipated seeing it in black and white. Turning the page, he quickly went over the Child Services case reports. After Evelyn died, Liam had been in and out of several foster homes. Among the reports cited are ones about unsafe surroundings, negligence, and the lad running away often. His last known location was with a Brooklyn foster home operator named Joan Mitchell, running a packed house. But the file had nothing that would explain why Liam had been at Evelyn's tomb that evening. None of any legal guardian bringing him there or any sign that anyone had been looking for him mentioned. Closing the file, Alexander exhaled gently. The more he discovered about Liam's past, the more obviously alone this lad had been for far too long. It unsettled him. He had never seen himself as the paternal kind, never thought of running someone else's life. But now Liam was here. Alexander could not deny the mounting sense of obligation chewing at him. That evening, Alexander came home earlier than usual. Liam was in the living room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by his new books. The sight was practically dreamlike. He had seen children in passing, at charitable events, at the homes of business associates, but never like this, never as part of his own life. "How was your day?" Loosening his tie as he entered, Alexander inquired. Liam turned to look, apparently startled by the inquiry. "Good," he answered tentatively. Alexander nodded, then settled on the couch. "What are you currently reading?" Liam hesitated, then raised one of the books. Rebecca had chosen this assortment of classic tales for him. Alexander probed. "Do you like them?" Liam shrugged. "Guessed. A few seem really depressed." Alexander slanted back and considered it. Stories had always captivated him because of their human revelations rather than their storylines. Every narrative concealed a secret truth buried within its words. "Sad stories can be valuable," he remarked. They impart knowledge we would not otherwise acquire. Liam nodded, giving a considered look. Did you ever, when you were a child, read sad stories? Alexander was startled by the question, though naturally he had read. Nothing like what Liam was reading. Long before he found any actual use for them, business publications and financial reports had molded his childhood. He said, "Not really." Liam did not advocate for more. Rather, he put the book down and grabbed another, idly leafing through the pages. They seldom spoke for a while. The silence felt almost natural, pleasant. Alexander was observing the lad, and noted how his regular food and sleep had already begun to make him appear better. He still had the wary air of someone not used to readily trusting, but there were times like now when he seemed to let his guard down just a little. "I found some information about your past today," Alexander remarked at last. Liam stiffened just a little, his fingers clutching the book's edges. Alexander stopped before picking back on. "On your birth certificate, your mother never mentioned a father." He paid great attention to Liam's reaction. The lad said nothing but struggled to swallow. Alexander waited, allowing time for processing. Liam said at last, his voice subdued, "She never talked about him." Alexander nodded in expectation of that response. "Do you ever give him any thought?" Liam gave a swift head shake. "Numer. Should he want me, he would have been here." The simplicity of the remark really struck Alexander more forcefully than he had anticipated. Not sure what to reply to, he just nodded. Liam's reasoning was upsetting in its candor. After Liam retired to bed later that evening, Alexander remained at the window, gazing out on the city below. His head was whirling. Having lived his entire life assessing risks against benefits, he had made judgments grounded in reason and profit. This, however, was not business. This was somewhat different as well. He could leave, find Liam a better place to live, assign someone else duty. Still, the idea of sending Liam away tasted sour in his mouth. His phone buzzed, dragging him from his daydream. That was Daniel. Daniel continued without preamble. "I found something else." "What is it?" asked with a tense voice. "One of the older databases has a record sealed in there. When Liam was a small child, Evelyn Carter asked for paternity tests, though the name she mentioned as the possible father was never followed up on." Daniel froze. That was Mark Donovan. Alexander hesitated. He knew the name right away. A name whispered in boardrooms and sprayed over corporate news was Mark Donovan. A billionaire investor, merciless in his dealings, a man well known for his aggressive tactics and overnight company destruction capacity. Alexander had worked with him before and even thought of him as a rival in some spheres. It seemed practically unthinkable that Liam could be his son. "But are you sure if it is true?" Alexander sought. Daniel answered 100%. "The records are there. Evelyn has to have suspected, but never had the opportunity to legally confirm it." Alexander took a long breath, his head whirling. That turned everything around if Mark Donovan were Liam's father. Alexander also had no doubt that Donovan would not take it lightly if he discovered. The man was as strong as he was commanding. Whether Liam wanted it or not, he would pick him if he wanted him. Alexander's hold got tighter on his phone. Years of power game playing in the corporate world had defined him, but this was different. It was not about deals or money here. This was about a youngster who had already lost too much, and Alexander was going to let someone like Mark Donovan take away the meager security Liam had just begun to discover. That night Alexander slept little at all. The knowledge that Mark Donovan might be Liam's father had sent his head whirling in unexpected directions. Before, he had dealt with merciless businessmen, men who would do everything to achieve their goals. But this was a child's life, not a business transaction, and he wasn't about to let Mark Donovan fly in and seize control just because he could. Alexander knew his decision before dawn. More significantly, he had to find out what to do should Mark be Liam's father. He also had to verify the truth. He could not risk the lad being put into another storm of doubt. Liam sat silently at the breakfast table, lightly tapping at his eggs with his fork. His customary cautious attitude had returned, although he had been more aloof since their chat the night before. Alexander watched him and felt an odd protective instinct becoming stronger. "How would you like to visit the park today?" he said. Liam raised his head, his eyebrows wrinkling. The park. Alexander shook his head. Center Park. Thought you might wish to spend some time out. Liam hesitated, then gave a little shrug. Okay, I guess. Though it was something. It was not enthusiasm. Later that morning, they turned up at Central Park. Though not overly frigid, the October air was chilly. Joggers, families, and street performers were abound in the park, creating melodic sound. With hands tucked in his jacket pockets, Liam strolled next to Alexander. His eyes flew about as though he still didn't know whether he belonged there. Alexander had seen that kind of expression in business acquaintances uncomfortable in his environment. Still, it was different with Liam. It was not only doubt. It was a deep-seated conviction that he was constantly one step away from falling behind once more. They eventually came onto a bench close to a pond, and Liam settled in to watch some children feeding the ducks. Uncertain of how to strike up the discussion, Alexander sat next to Liam. He understood they absolutely must have it. You said your mom never discussed your father, he said. Liam tensed, then nodded. What if she set out to find him? Alexander asked very deliberately. Liam looked at him, his eyes dubious. What do you mean? Alexander picked his words very deliberately. What if she tried to verify it and had questions about who he was? Liam scowled, considering the concept. I am not sure, he said. She said nothing at all. She simply put in a lot of labor. She avoided discussing things like that. He turned aside, his voice softer. She seemed to be terrified of something. Alexander felt an old discomfort settle in his chest. Evelyn was not without cause if she had been terrified. And should Mark Donovan be the father, that anxiety could have been justified. If you could definitely find out for sure, would you want to? Alexander questioned. Liam hesitated, then gave a little shrug. I'm not certain. I suppose it has little bearing. Not here, right? Alexander let out a measured breath. The lad had learnt not to hope, since he had been deserted in so many different ways. That was an uncomfortable awareness. What if he did know about you? Alexander asked cautiously. What if he found out now? Liam stiffened. I don't want him to, he said fast. It makes no difference if he's a wealthy guy or whatever. Why would I need him now when he was absent when my mom needed him? Liam's voice had a piercing determination that made Alexander feel something settle in his chest. The lad had no need of another strong man treating him as a duty. He yearned for steadiness. He needed someone not going to vanish. And Alexander understood quite precisely that he did not want to pass Liam over to anyone, not even if Mark Donovan proved to be his biological father. Though he was unsure about the timing of the change, the thought of letting Liam go felt improper in a way never experienced in his regimented life. Alexander met Daniel in his office that evening. He felt the weight of his choice bearing on him. Alexander added without preamble, "We need a paternity test." Ever the professional, Daniel nodded only. "I can arrange it quietly," he continued. "But if Donovan finds out, he'll come looking." Alexander squeezed his jaw. "Then we ensure he remains uninformed. At least not just yet." For a time, Daniel observed him. "You already decided, haven't you?" he asked. "You're not giving Liam up even if his father is involved." Alexander breathed out and ran a palm over his face. "The lad has been through enough," he said. "I'll not let some billionaire with a god complex walk in and claim him as a business acquisition." Daniel smirked. "Given your god complex as a billionaire, that's a hell of a stance." Alexander shot him a glance, but Daniel merely laughed. Daniel said, "All right. I will finish the test discreetly. Still, we have to have a strategy if Donovan is the father. He isn't fair." Alexander was aware beforehand of this. He had seen personally how Mark Donovan bought out businesses and drove individuals into corners until they had no alternative but to submit. But Alexander wasn't about to let Liam be handled like a pawn in someone else's game. Liam was a youngster. 2 days later, Daniel delivered him an envelope including the test findings. Alexander opened it with firm hands, his heart thumping more than he would have wanted to confess. He swiftly went over the paper, then exhaled hard at the end. Liam's biological father was, indeed, Mark Donovan. Sitting back in his chair, Alexander let the reality sink in. Though he had expected it, Seeing the validation gave it more reality. The question now concerned what he would do with this knowledge. Though he had vowed himself not to let Liam be thrown into uncertainty once more, it would not be simple to keep this from Mark Donovan. The man had resources, should he ever come across them. He would insist on his rights. Alexander resolved at first he would say nothing. For as long as he could, he would shield Liam from the storm that was certain to arrive. Deep down, though, he knew it was only a matter of time until Mark Donovan discovered the truth, and Alexander would have to be ready for a fight unlike any he had waged before. Alexander realized he was on thin ice. Although it was dangerous to keep the paternity test findings under wraps, he couldn't let Mark Donovan run Liam's life. Alexander was not going to allow another strong guy treat him like an asset to be claimed. The lad had already gone through enough turbulence, but the weight of the truth followed him every day, and he knew it wouldn't be long before something compelled his hand. Liam had started to fit his new life. Alexander knew why, even though he still exuded caution. He was not used to the concept of permanency. The lad had been left in more than one sense, and he didn't find trust easy. There were, nevertheless, brief, fleeting times when Alexander glimpsed the child Liam may have been if life had been more gentle to him. Like when they strolled along the Hudson River or visited a bookshop in Midtown, and Liam's eyes lit up at the shelves stacked high with stories, or when Liam, for the first time, asked Alexander a question about his early years. These events let Alexander realize Liam still harbors hope hidden deep inside him despite all. When Alexander got home one evening, Liam was seated at the dining table with an open book in front of him. The lad was staring at the pages, apparently deep in contemplation, not reading at all. "Something on your mind?" As he laid down his briefcase, Alexander questioned. Liam stopped before nodding. "I was considering my mom," Liam said softly. Alexander drew out a chair and sat across from him. "What about her?" Liam held a finger along the book's edge. "She put in a lot of work. I now know why she was always so tired, even though I never understood at first. She was checking on us, but I believe she was depressed as well." Alexander started to feel pity. Evelyn had done her best, but she had carried responsibilities none anyone else should have had to deal with. Alexander told her, "She loved you. That much is clear." Though he nodded, Liam looked nowhere. "Do you suppose she knew about my dad?" Alexander stopped to consider the topic. Liam had never asked straightforwardly before. He picked his words quite deliberately. "I believe she harbors suspicions," he remarked. "Perhaps she wasn't sure if he would be the kind of father you deserved." Liam raised his sharp, comprehending eyes. "He is a bad guy, then?" Alexander let out an exhalation. "Not exactly, but he's strong. Sometimes strong people make poor decisions about their families." For a time, Liam observed him. "Do you know who he is?" Alexander's chest squeezed. He had been fearing this exactly. "Lamb, you do," Liam said, his voice just above a whisper. "You know, and you omitted to tell me?" Alexander leaned forward, his voice cool yet forceful. "I was attempting to guard you. I had to be sure before I spoke." Liam closed his hands into fists. "Where is he?" Though he knew he couldn't lie, Alexander hesitated. Mark Donovan. For Liam initially, the name meant nothing. He wrinkled, trying to locate it. Then insight struck. His face took on gloomy tones. "The billionaire, the one on TV always?" nodded Alexander. Liam's face contorted with disbelief and rage. "He knew about you and didn't care." Alexander gave his head shakes. "He's not sure yet. I only learned lately. Your mother never told him." Liam got up so quickly that his chair scuffed across the floor. "So, what is happening now? Do you intend to inform him?" More than he would want to acknowledge, the fury in his voice was aimed at Alexander as much as Mark Donovan. "Not unless you want me to," Alexander responded quietly. "Liam, this is your life. You can help to decide what comes next." Liam moved about the room, his emotions fighting inside him. "What if he discovers otherwise? Suppose he attempts to whisk me away?" His voice trembled a little, revealing the terror under the fury. Alexander got up and rested a calm hand on the lad's shoulder. "I won't let that happen," he declared. "Unless you want to go, nobody is taking you anywhere." Searching his face, Liam looked for any trace of dishonesty. Not finding anything, he nodded shakily. Alexander felt things had altered that evening. He laid in bed. The truth was out, and going back was not possible. Liam had a strong father. Sooner or later, Mark Donovan would find out. Alexander would be prepared that day. No matter what it would take, he promised Liam he wouldn't allow anyone take him away. He meant to uphold his vow. Alexander understood the tranquility would not endure. A quiet countdown had started the instant Liam discovered his father's name. Mark Donovan was not the kind of man who stayed in the dark for extended periods of time, and Alexander had no doubts the millionaire would ultimately find the truth. The concern was, when he did, what would he do about it? For now, Liam kept quiet about it. The reality that his father was among the most powerful individuals in New York confused him. Alexander, though, observed the boy's attitude had changed subtly. He was more agitated, his eyes straying from their talks as if his head was whirling with unresolved questions all the time. Then one evening the questions erupted at last. It began with an easy knock on Alexander's office door. Looking up from the stack of papers he had been reading, he noticed Liam standing there, hands jammed into the pockets of his sweatshirt. The lad asked gingerly, "Can I ask you something?" Alexander set down his pen. "Clearly. What then is on your mind?" Liam entered, lingering close to the door as though he wasn't sure he really wanted to speak what was on his mind. Then, breathing deeply, he added, "Do you think you would have wanted me?" The inquiry struck Alexander more strongly than he anticipated. Of course, he had seen this coming. However, knowing Liam had been harboring this idea inside him still caused a wave of grief. "Liam," Alexander answered softly, "sometimes people don't recognize what they have until it's too late. Your mother decided to keep you out of his path. She was trying to protect you, not that you weren't wanted." Liam laughed simply and without humor. She felt he was dangerous. Alexander corrected by saying, "Not dangerous. But this man puts power before relationships, and your mother understood you deserved more than that." Though he still seemed concerned, Liam nodded slowly. "So will he want me now should he find out?" Alexander sighed and tapped his temples. "I don't know, Liam. You are not, however, merely some commercial asset. I know this. You are not a pawn in somebody's enterprise. Nobody except you gets to determine your value. You are your own individual." After giving those comments much thought, the lad said at last, "I don't know if I even want to meet him." Alexander gave a little but confident smile. "Then you are not obliged, of course. You have selected that." But the following day everything changed. Alexander's assistant hurried in, her face white with urgency, while he was in a conference. Breathlessly, "Sir," she whispered, "there's someone here to see you. He claims it's crucial." Alexander SC wrinkled, already feeling discomfort. "Mark Donovan. Who is it?" The name set Alexander's system on chilly shock. He made himself stand still and keep calm. "Where is he?" "In the lobby." Alexander changed his clothes and headed downstairs, getting ready for the approaching storm. Alexander saw Mark Donovan right away as soon he entered the foyer. The billionaire exuded authority and control in his stance and had a dominating presence from his well-fitting suit. His chilly blue eyes fixed on Alexander's approach. "Alexander," Mark said, greeting fluidly, "we need to talk." Alexander pointed the billionaire inside a secluded conference room. Mark lost no time. The door closed. His voice short, he replied, "I assume you know why I'm here." Alexander stared back at him equally. "I can roughly predict." Mark folded his arms, his face becoming hard. "I hate being kept in the dark, especially about something this important." "And what precisely do you regard to be significant?" Alexander questioned deliberately. Mark's face became even more austere. "A child. My darling." Between them, silence dense with strain stretched. Alexander had anticipated this encounter, but now that it was underway he understood just how much he hated the idea of Mark Donovan claiming anything over Liam. "What would you wish for?" Alexander inquired at last. "What would you say?" Mark stooped slightly forward. "I would like to see my son." Alexander's jaw grew tighter. He's not some trophy you get to claim now that you know he exists. Mark's eyes shot with annoyance. I never said he was, but you don't get to make this decision for him either. Alexander let out a leisurely exhale to attempt to control his anger. He hardly knows if he should meet you. I meant to uphold my commitment to him, that he would have options in this. Mark watched him for a long time before nodding just slightly. Great. Although I want to message him, I won't push anything. Alexander paused, then turned back. I shall forward it to him. Still, no pressure. Not even a little manipulation. You back off if he does not want interaction. Mark nodded with a smile. We would see. Feeling the weight of what was to come, Alexander sat with Liam at the dinner table later that evening. Pulling out the sealed envelope, he placed it on the table. From Mark, it's... Liam fixated on it like if it were a ticking bomb. What does it say? Alexander sighed. I'm not sure. I told him I would let you decide if you wanted to read it. Liam paused long enough to grab for the envelope. He opened it deliberately, his eyes glancing within the letter. Alexander saw Liam's look change from uncertainty to confusion, then something else, something unreadable. At last Liam laid the letter down and glanced up. His voice inscrutable, he added, He wants to meet me. His hands quivered just a little. Alexander maintained his evenness in tone. And do you want to meet him? Liam drew in a hard swallow. I am not sure, he said, but I suppose I ought to. Alexander nodded, his chest uncomfortably tense. This moment he knew would arrive. He simply had not anticipated it arriving so quickly. Liam sat in Alexander's car's rear the following day, gazing out at New York City's cityscape as they neared the restaurant where he was scheduled to first see his father. His hands closed together on his lap. His head whirled with questions he wasn't sure he wanted responses for. Suppose Mark Donovan was not the man he had envisioned. What if he wanted nothing more than to wipe Liam from his life? Cold, uncaring, or worse? As the car slowed in front of a Manhattan luxury restaurant, his heart grew tighter. Alexander lay a comforting hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this, he gently reminded him. Liam nodded and tried hard to swallow. Though I know I have to. Heart thumping. He got out of the car and headed toward the door. The maitre d' sent him straight to a quiet area of the restaurant. Mark Donovan sat at a table close to the window there. The man stood out in any setting with his crisp suit, immaculate hair, and attitude of authority, that which he exuded in the media. But Liam approached and saw something surprising. Mark was not staring at him with calculation or indifference. His manner was quite different, uncertainty, perhaps even anxiety. As the lad approached the table, Mark remarked, Liam. Mark stood. I'm happy you dropped by. Liam nodded and dropped down across from him. It was quiet for a minute. Mark then exhaled, slanted slightly forward. I admit not expecting you to trust me, he said. I need you to know I didn't know about you. You hardly seem like someone I would like either. Should I have? His voice faded, as though he wasn't sure how to wrap up the line. Liam examined him closely, considering whether he believed him. At last he questioned, Why did my mom keep me away from you? Mark stiffened his jaw. Because she lacked faith in me, he said, and I am not blaming her for it. Young, aspirational, and more focused on empire building than anything else I was. But had she told me, if I had known, he gave his head a shake, I would have done things differently. Liam found it difficult to react to that. One part of him wanted to believe him. Another questioned whether it really mattered now. At last he inquired, What do you want from me? Mark turned to soften his look. Nothing. I just want to know you. As they discussed little matters, Liam's education, his passions, his life with Alexander, the conversation proceeded leisurely and wary. Mark paid great attention, asked questions sometimes, but he never pushed too hard. Liam came to see, for the first time, that his father was equally dubious about this conference as he was. Mark paused as the evening progressed before going into his pocket to extract an envelope. He said, I wanted to give you this, sliding it over the table, but I wanted to not overwhelm you. Liam grabbed it and asked dubious questions to him. What is it? A letter, Mark remarked. I started it the evening I learned about you. Though I didn't know how, it's all I wanted to express. Liam hesitated, then slid the envelope into his pocket, although he wasn't sure when, or if he would ever read it. For now it seemed sufficient to know that it existed. Mark cleared his voice while they ate. "I know I can't change the past," he remarked, "but the door is open if you ever want to talk, if you want to be in my life." Liam stared at him for a protracted period before nodding at last. Okay. It did not constitute a promise. It was a start rather than a commitment. Alexander was waiting for Liam in the car as he emerged outside. He examined the face of the lad closely. "What went on?" Alexander inquired. Liam breathed, turned back toward the eatery, then looked at Alexander. "Better than I had hoped." Alexander grinned and laid a hand on his shoulder. "That's all that matters." Liam pulled the envelope from his pocket and ran his fingers over the edges as they headed home. He opened it later, but for the first time in his life, he felt as though perhaps, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this world after all. Did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how powerful was this tale? Smash that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story that stirs your soul. For more heart-racing, emotional tales, tap the end screen now.